This is one of those kind of seminal light bulb moments that started changing how I thought about groups. Was we had a pretty functional group except for this one kid that was completely shutting down, wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. The group was building a lot of resentment towards him because they wanted to hike, they wanted to go to different locations, and they were just stuck in this one campsite. Everyone, staff included, I think even if they wouldn't have wanted to admit it, was like, okay, this kid is the problem. A lot of staff energy was going towards managing, trying to keep some goodwill from the group towards this one kid. And eventually he had to leave for medical reasons. He wasn't eating or drinking, had to get him to a higher level of care. And there was this like air of celebration amongst the group as he departed. It was like, oh, we're finally going to get to go hike, do the things we want to do. And I was struck by how short that honeymoon period lasted. Within 2 hours after just like a moderate hike, another individual who had been respectful, considerate, reasonable up to that point, he just basically escalated emotionally, and that became his new normal. He had like basically a little mini breakdown, and two staff had to be pulled over to meet with him, and the group had just immediately took that same attitude towards him that they had with the other kid. And it was like, okay, we've filled the scapegoat role within 2 hours. The group was able to just slot him right in there. And so it had this feeling of like the group being haunted, so to speak. There was a zeitgeist. There was a very established dynamic that the group preferred, and it was finding a new individual to slot into that role.
Here's like almost like there is these archetypal roles within every group that are sort of there, like empty seats waiting to be filled. And then whenever a group starts to form, it's like people are going to go sit on those seats regardless. And then they're going to play those roles. They're going to act them out. All right, welcome to the show. I'm joined here by Aodhán and Brant. To get started, let's just dive right in. Brant, how would you describe group relations to somebody hearing about this for the first time? Like, what is group relations?
The way we usually talk about it is that I'm in the therapeutic world. So when I'm describing a conference, people have in their mind this idea of going to a lecture, intaking information, learning a new skill, learning a subsect of whatever therapeutic application. And group relations is entirely experiential, which is both kind of scary for a lot of people when they step into it, bewildering, it's terrifying. You're basically asked to look at what's happening in the room right now and start to like talk about it. What I found really quickly when I stepped into that work is that in these large groups and these small groups, when you're just asked to look at what's happening in the group at the moment, a lot of regression happens. A lot of our normal defense mechanisms comes up, and you start to see the roles that we take that are really familiar just become crystallized very, very quickly. And so, yeah, I mean, the challenge of naming competition or attraction or anger or disgust, like in the room as it's happening, we're conditioned very strongly to not talk about these things typically, but they impact the groups that we're in at a very profound level. And so group relations work seeks to highlight that, look at the power and the differences in the room, look at how different group identities come up and arise, and asks us to basically tease that apart.
Yeah. So these social dynamics are at work in almost every group in human society, but they're invisible and they're never ever spoke about. And what this does is it makes them conscious, and because it makes them conscious, then we're more in a position we're more empowered, and then can change these dynamics potentially.
Yeah, well, we talk about creating a choice point, kind of like you're speaking to. If you're aware of dynamics and you start to build that muscle and build that capacity to ask questions about, hey, that's interesting. Like everyone, when we broke into subgroups, there were 3 people that didn't have to move their chairs. Like why did everyone else rally around them? There's some power in not having to move your seat and having everyone group around you. It's stuff that you notice, but or you subconsciously notice because everyone knows to group around those powerful individuals, but we never talk about it. And whether you're on a sports team or in a board meeting or doing small group therapy, these dynamics are in play, whether or not you're thinking about them, like the attraction, the competition, those emotional pieces that influence us are happening. So it's about, do we build that capacity to recognize what's already there?
I think it's probably important to note as well that in the conferences themselves, there are trained consultants who point out these dynamics that are happening. So, these people have been in this game for, 20, 30 years, and then they're really sensitive to what's happening unconsciously in a group. And then they'll actually point this out and, make it big, as we were saying. They'll might use very visceral sort of graphic language to try and bring up in everyone's imagination what's happening. And then when that happens, people are, again, they're like super resistant to sort of acknowledge what might be happening. It can be super uncomfortable to acknowledge, as Brant said, like basic things like competition and attraction, which are just like part of every human group. It's super interesting.
Yeah. And they'll be blunt and borderline offensive with what they throw out there, stuff that's really intense to hear, and then evokes a reaction, but in the spirit of like asking better questions and seeing the dynamics.
And everyone knows that. Like, everyone can feel that on an embodied level in a group when something is unsaid, or when something, you can feel it in your body. You go a bit cold, or you feel like you're sort of walking on eggshells. But the purpose in group relations is to say these things out loud as you experience them, so that you're sensitized to them.
Super interesting. Now, for somebody listening to this that, there's 100 things they could be listening to right now, but they're tuning into the specific conversation. Why would you say this is important, and how can this improve their life by learning about this subject? And Aodhán, do you want to answer this one?
I can give it a go. I'll ask Brant to jump in as well. But I think we touched on a lot of it there, especially for, say, coaches and consultants and people working with like senior executives, but it works with any group. You can be more aware of these unconscious dynamics that are taking a group off their primary task, as they call it in the work, right? And then you can work with the group rather than grating up against it and causing all of these different conflicts to sort of go awry and pull the group off task, right?
Yeah, I would add that I think it's useful on a couple of different levels. We end the book with, I believe the chapter is called "Here and Now Work for Us as a Culture." You can look at how this affects how we show up in our small teams at work, or even our family units or our friend groups. Like, hopefully this material will change and help folks evolve their consciousness towards how they show up in groups, and how they not getting stuck in the same dynamics that may be tanking work teams, maybe causing friction and just like pulling us into dynamics around things like scapegoating, or we talk a lot about the drama triangles, another really good application of this stuff. But there's a bigger societal lens. Like, we're seeing this massive political polarization. We're seeing projection from both sides of the aisle. In America right now, after the election, we're seeing a lot of friction in families and folks who are asking questions around, like, okay, we have different political views. How do we navigate some of these dynamics at this point? And so I think that it can be, not to say that our work is doing all the lifting there, but I think we need to be paying a lot of attention to group dynamics, and specifically how we project like the badness and the parts of ourselves that we do not want to own onto others. Right now in history, it feels really important to me.
Mm-hmm. And then, like, on the individual level, I'll just say there that, the societal level, I think, like, the purpose of the work is to always go back to the societal level. I think that's originally how it was sort of founded on, trying to make a difference in society after like with the World War specifically. But on the individual level, you'll see in yourself the repetition of patterns in groups over and over and over. You might get put into the same positions and roles over and over. And because of the nature of the work is to speak these things out loud, you'll actually have people tell you the truth, as close as you can get to that truth, about what's actually happening in the here and now, and you'll have that reflected back at you. So you can actually figure out or begin to approximate how you show up and how other people see you and how you affect other people and other groups, that can be incredibly helpful. That was for me anyways.
It's super important. The image that comes to mind for me when we're talking about this on maybe a societal level, and maybe this is the wrong metaphor, but puppet strings came to mind. It's like if you're not aware of these dynamics, you're almost like a puppet on strings. You're sort of just being played by the group. Whereas whenever you become aware of it, you might be able to sort of cut those strings and maybe navigate groups in a more effective way. Is that right enough ballpark or?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We talk about the unspoken deal that is basically put in front of us as group members. Like we will step into those roles and yeah, it's like the puppet strings we start to play on the puppet strings. But I like to think about it as we're always getting something from that role, and we're also sacrificing something to have that role. That's true of things that we typically think of in positive light, like a leadership role. You're taking on some costs there. There's some responsibility. There's a primatologist, Francis Walls, that talks a lot about the cost of being a leader in a group of primates is that like you make some mistakes and like people are gunning for you. There's a lot of bad things that can happen in that position. And on the flip side of that, we think of the role of the scapegoat as really undesirable. Like I don't want to step into a scapegoat role. But there is like a value proposition in that. Like I get to escape responsibility. The group doesn't demand much of me. I'm noticed. There's a lot of attention on me, even though it's negative attention. And some group members, there's like, they crave that at some level. And so, yes, we're stepping in and we're getting played by the group, but we're also kind of like co-signing this unspoken contract somehow.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. To what extent can we say that a group has a mind of its own? Aodhán, do you want to tackle this one?
Well, I guess one of the assumptions of the group relations work is that the unconscious is sort of up to something. It has its mind of its own, and then I guess the purpose of the work then is to try and figure out exactly what that is. What they might be doing to certain members to make them act and react in certain ways.
Okay. Brant, in the book, you tell a story so you worked for a long time in wilderness therapy, and you tell a story of Sam and Jesse. And can you maybe, I think this is a really impactful example of, about how these dynamics can show up. Can you maybe just tell us about that story and why it's important?
Yeah. And so this would have been, I changed the names. Of course, these are not actual real students that I worked with. But for those that aren't familiar at all, wilderness therapy, which is coming under a lot of heat recently, but historically also has, I think, done some really great work. You have a group of 8 to 12 adolescent boys in this case, come in with presenting issues. Sometimes it could be around drug use or dropping out of school or unexplored trauma that's just really making it hard for them to function. There's a lot of different issues that can send them there. And you have 4 trained wilderness guides that work with them during the week, therapist that comes in, but you're out in the wilderness. So they don't have access to technology or anything like that. They basically have nothing that they want, but kind of all the things that they need. So it's really ripe for group dynamic study. And in this particular example, this is one of those kind of seminal light bulb moments that started changing how I thought about groups. Was we had a pretty functional group, except for this one kid that was completely shutting down, wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. The group was building a lot of resentment towards him because they wanted to hike, they wanted to go to different locations, and they were just stuck in this one campsite. Everyone, staff included, I think even if they wouldn't have wanted to admit it, was like, okay, this kid is the problem. A lot of staff energy was going towards managing, trying to keep some goodwill from the group towards this one kid. And eventually he had to leave for medical reasons. He wasn't eating or drinking, had to get him to a higher level of care. And there was this like air of celebration amongst the group as he departed. It was like, oh, we're finally going to get to go hike, do the things we want to do. And I was struck by how short that honeymoon period lasted. Within 2 hours, after just like a moderate hike, another individual who had been respectful, considerate, reasonable up to that point, he just basically escalated emotionally, and that became his new normal. He had like basically a little mini breakdown, and two staff had to be pulled over to meet with him, and the group had just immediately took that same attitude towards him that they had with the other kid. And it was like, okay, there's immediately we filled the scapegoat role within 2 hours. The group was able to just slot him right in there. And so it had this feeling of like the group being haunted, so to speak. There was a zeitgeist. There was a very established dynamic that the group preferred, and it was finding a new individual to slot into that role.
Wow. Wow, that's absolutely mind blowing. And when I think of almost every group that I've belonged to, there's always a scapegoat. I've never once been in a group that hasn't played out. So you guys focus a lot on mythology, archetypes, and the relationship between these things and group psychology. Just before we get into that, something that's sort of come to mind here is like almost like there is these archetypal roles within every group that are sort of there, like empty seats waiting to be filled. And then whenever a group starts to form, it's like people are going to go sit on those seats regardless, and then they're going to play those roles. They're going to act them out.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well said. There's not a ton I would add to that. I think that's just a simple way, not a simple concept, but way to say that gets at it, right? Like there are these roles. And Aodhán, I'll let you speak to this too, but we really like this idea of applying what's called the mythopoetic lens and looking at how stories, how myths, the stories that we pass down, how those are actually telling us the story of our groups as well, and the roles that we end up taking up in our groups.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the idea of applying the myth to the groups was that, it's common across Robert Bly, Robert Moore, Jung, and Joseph Campbell would probably be the more popular one that that the listeners would know. But the idea is obviously stories that have staying power across time and across cultures. There's something like very resonant in them that speak to how we're put together, maybe as individuals and groups and cultures. And then, the mythopoetic tradition talks about myths as accounts of within the individual psyche, but then we decided to take this and to apply it to the group psyche.
So that means that if we're taking that stance and looking at it through that lens, that we consider the characters in a story to be elements within a group, right? So the way I would have read like Odysseus when I was in middle school is that I probably would have identified with Odysseus as the main character, and he's going through these trials and tribulations, and he has to be this clever leader and get through all of these awful situations. And this is taking a step back and then asking, okay, so in our group, like where's that Cyclops energy? Aodhán does I don't want to step too much on Aodhán's story, but he has a really good story of looking at Circe's island and how that interaction plays and with the dynamics of attraction in groups. So we're looking at each element, each character in the story as a piece within the group, and that just again informs us in how we ask questions. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Aodhán, in the talk you sent me, I thought it was really interesting about the time you were at a group relations conference, and you went into a group, and there was a female in that group, and basically a dynamic arose that really influenced your behavior. Do you want to maybe share that with us? And I think that ties in really well here too.
Yeah, I can do that. And let me just, I guess it's helpful to read a myth as well, actually, just to sort of paint the picture of what we're trying to do in the group as well. So I'll start by just reading the myth then. This is Circe and Odysseus, basically. So Odysseus and his men land on the island of Aea, home of the goddess and sorceress Circe, whose home is encircled by strangely docile lions. She invites Odysseus's men to a meal of honey and cheese and wine, which she has laced with a magical potion. On eating the meal, Odysseus's men turn into pigs. So yeah, the story that you're talking about now was from one of these residential group relations conferences, a 2-week one that I went to. And there is an intergroup event where the whole conference will go into a room and they will decide amongst themselves, basically, what themes to work on. So this is all emergent sort of themes from this group. As the groups began to form, I noticed that I was sort of drawn inexplicably towards this group member with this particular member we'll call Z, right? And at the time, I was not consciously aware of, what was going on, or I was just drawn towards the group because I was captivated by her expressiveness. She would like speak in a very kind of slow and sultry manner, and she complimented my physique, and was even like sexually expressive at times in this group. So then, over the next 2 days, I sort of noticed a change in myself. And I became increasingly unaware to sort of engage with this group. And I got very silent and tired, and I eventually abruptly left one of the sessions, right? Like even talking about this is awkward. And I think that speaks to the awkwardness of this, in groups in general, not to mention the workplace. It's even difficult in group relations. So I went back to the group the following day, and that same sort of energy it came to me again. I was tired, unable to engage with this group, and then I basically realized I need help, and I asked the group to assist me and try and help me articulate what's going on, because I genuinely couldn't find the words. It was completely stuck, as if I was walking through honey or something like that. So yes, these members in the group, they were far more experienced at navigating these dynamics than I am. So she said to me, well, you're just jealous of this dynamic between this, other person in the group and me. And this realization seriously like opened me up, and I felt as if I don't know. I felt as if there was an awareness coming to me that allowed me to re-engage with the group again. I realized she was actually correct. It was like jealousy. So these things are kind of lurking below the surface that I didn't know were happening because of whatever my limitations of my experience. And then this enables me to actually begin working with the group again once we talk about it. So there's a metaphor here, and I mention it again. We mention it in the book. The metaphor is, drinking Cersei's potion in some way, that I'm pulled into the group.
As docile too. I think that's such a potent detail. Like the docile lions that are like you've lost. There's no fierceness there, right?
No. And yeah, I guess in the story, to go back to the story again, what happens in the myth is Hermes, the god who is associated with borders because of Hermes in ancient Greece were the stones that mark the borders of the cities. So then he becomes internalized and he becomes the god of the unconscious. And Hermes comes and meets Odysseus and tells him to eat the molly herb. And then this molly herb in myth and throughout history, say with the church fathers and the Stoics, is associated with bring darkness into light. It has like a dark root and a white tip, say. So he tells him to eat this molly herb and to charge at them with his sword. So with fierceness, to bring a fierce energy, as Brant just said. And once he does this, her energy changes and she becomes an ally rather than an adversary. So this just speaks to something very deep this speaks to something very deep that happened, I think, in the group, and I guess in groups more generally that can happen.
That's an incredible story, and thank you for sharing that. That's probably not easy to do. Whenever that happened, whenever it was brought to light, brought to awareness, what was that experience like for you? Was that uncomfortable? Was it liberating? What was your internal experience like at that time?
Well, it's probably influenced by me being a Catholic. It's it was incredibly shameful to have being pulled into a group through like this, base desire. But then the more you do these group relations conferences, the more you're comfortable with yourself and talking about these more, uncomfortable things. So initially it was uncomfortable, but because you're with the type of people that you're with in those groups, they're generally very dialed in these realms. It's actually very easy to work through these things, work through these difficult parts of yourself, and figure them out. And I think that's probably one of the biggest fruits of the conferences, as I said earlier, is you get to sort of you get to come up against these like patterns or these parts of human experience that you wouldn't get to otherwise, because these conferences sort of replicate like, a joining and then a, storming. You're figuring out how to fight and come together. You're figuring out how to come together. You're navigating all the conflicts that happen, and then they end. So you get to do these cycles very quickly, whereas in real life, or you don't get to do that quite as much.
Yeah, there's a freedom in there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That must be such an interesting experience, like just sort of like almost like a laboratory for human relations and things that would normally take years, decades to pan out, happening in like weeks or even days. That must be incredible.
Yeah. And I think that's worth saying as well. I know Brant and I said we actually should mention this. It's actually not for everybody, because it can be very intense. It can be very, very intense. And especially if you're going through a difficult time in your life, you probably should steer clear of the conferences.
It's not a therapeutic experience by design. It can be. There's definitely a lot of catharsis that people experience. I left my first conference feeling frustrated, angry, offensive, and mainly at the brilliant Dr. Leslie Prissett, who was one of my consultants on the team, and he ended up, writing the foreword for our book. We have a great relationship now. I really respect the hell out of him. But that what makes that work potent, the fact that it can get into those taboo and those scary regions and the like houses or the rooms in our house that we haven't explored, so to speak. That's like where the power is. But yeah, it's not. I would not recommend it for somebody that's dealing with a lot of stress, unresolved trauma. Like, you will regress in this environment. You're in an altered state almost as soon as you step in. It is wild.
It sounds like a psychedelic experience almost. One of the things you say, one of the core assumptions is that there are no coincidences in group behavior. Can you maybe expand on that, Brant?
Yeah. The easiest low-hanging fruit example is that when somebody leaves the room during a session to go to the bathroom or for any reason, that's a great, everyone loves to point at that in classical group relations work and say like, oh, some part of the group finds this conversation intolerable and has to leave. And there's, you'll always hear somebody, well, no, I just had to pee. I drank too much coffee at the break. People love to default to the individual explanations for the behavior, which may or may not be valid. But the idea of this work is looking at it through that group lens. As Aodhán said, like, what is the group up to? What is the group unconscious doing? Why was that member the one that the group expelled, so to speak? What was it about this conversation that was too uncomfortable? And you don't have to 100% always believe that, but in this work, we take the stance of being agnostic towards it and being curious and saying, well, okay, what if that is the case? Another example, I think I referenced this earlier, but didn't really give good context for it. Aodhán and I were running a seminar in Norway recently with a small kind of group of consultants, and we had them self-organize into breakout groups. And I always do this in a presentation. I like to give them a prompt, and then I like to just watch what happens. I like to watch the body language, and I like to watch like how they group up. But we noticed that a couple of their members were the ones that did not have to move their chairs. Everyone grouped around them. And I asked them about it later, what was going on there. And those were the bosses, I think, right? Like, those were the directors and like the higher ups, and everyone like grouped around them. And it's just this like unconscious dynamic. Nobody
they didn't know each other. Apparently, you know, a lot of them were from different companies because for this specific event. So even on like that deeply unconscious level, they just still organize in a certain way. It was very interesting.
Yeah, I intentionally like don't educate myself about all the dynamics of the people in the room so that I have a fresh palette. But yeah, Aodhán was letting me know it's like actually those were the most powerful people in the room. And yeah, you will also you'll see it as who's allowed to talk about attraction, who's in the conversation when like competition starts to come up. Like the who and the when are good questions to ask around those group dynamics. It's like it's not a coincidence that they're well, for a long time I would see this pretty consistently in conferences that the group would mobilize like a younger white woman to emote for the group, and it would be like a young white woman was brought up to cry for whatever reason, whatever stuff was coming up, and this was like a consistent thing. That's just like one example, and it's not always about like the identity politics, so to speak, but we just get curious about those questions, basically.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting as well. This came up in the seminar too. What's not allowed to be said, and it's often in like what's not allowed to be said. There's obviously so much power in say even silence. So you know why aren't people talking about competition? Why aren't people talking about attraction? Again, they're just easy examples, and it's usually because that's underground and like ruling the group in some way. And I challenge you just to think about it yourself, like yourself, Niall, or people listening. I guarantee you'll start seeing this stuff and you'll be like wondering about it, and it'll freak you out a bit, but it's kind of great.
One just quick caveat to that though is that most groups, most work teams, they don't. This sounds obvious, but they don't need to explore attraction to get like the project done by Q2 or whatever, right? Like it's, but those dynamics are influencing how they interact. So our stance is not that every work team, every therapy group should be talking about the deepest, darkest, suppressed stuff that's going on in that group. There's that trope of the like first year, second year therapy grad student that goes back to Thanksgiving dinner and is like trying to therapize their whole family. Like I've been in that spot before when I was a little younger, and it's really tempting to like do that with this work as well. And so there's like a note of caution there. We're not like advocating to just grab these concepts and just start willy-nilly applying them, but just that idea of starting to be curious and at least to recognize them in your own, like, okay, something's going on over here. What's the group up to? Can be really helpful.
Yeah, this is really making me think. Like I've just in the groups I've been involved in like even like in my family and stuff, there's just some things you just know not to say, you know, and to say them evokes a really strong negative emotional response. You know, it's sort of like we're sort of hardwired just to maintain the status quo of the group almost, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But something that I found that ties in well with what we've just spoke about that I found really interesting from the book was your thoughts on hierarchy. And the question here would be, are hierarchies inevitable in human groups? Whether they're visible or invisible, there always is a hierarchy at work. What are your thoughts here? We could start with Aodhán and then we go over to Brant. Just to
Well, I guess just to pull again, it's pulling from the book, but I guess there's even from the example earlier, there's always going to be something that people organize around, and it's common nowadays to sort of talk about flat hierarchies and equalizing power, and like you hear all of this kind of stuff nowadays, but then I guess the thing we explore in the book is, but where does the power go then? It just there's a different hierarchy, or it inverts in some way or something like that, you know. Yeah.
Interesting. Brant?
I consider my simple definition for hierarchy, and at least in my own mind, is just that's what crystallized power differences look like, formal or informal. I was handed at a recent director job I had, I was handed an organizational chart that it wasn't like a flow chart kind of who manages who. It was just a bunch of names and titles. And it was like this fantasy of a flat hierarchy, but of course these people are accountable to. So I had to, it just made it more confusing. It was like to cooperate with this, frankly, adolescent fantasy that's like so that certain groups are so enamored with these days. It's like I have to now do all this extra work. Like, does this person report to them, or like I need to send an email to this department? Do I include this person? Like, what? It made the job harder, basically, just so that everyone can like play along with this fantasy that we're a flat organization. And it wasn't even explicitly said that they were, but you could just see that way of thinking was like permeated in there. That was like how they wanted to present the organization. I think hierarchies are inevitable. Western man did not invent hierarchies. That's one of the things we draw on, and why I think myth is helpful. You do get to see across all different cultures, across different times of human evolution and culture. You see the stories reflect hierarchy, and you see certain kind of energies or attributes often given to like the kingly god or role or whatever, and like the caretaking role is often characterized as more as feminine, which we look at that from like a Jungian perspective, where men and women both have access to like male and feminine archetypal energies. But ignore those things at your own peril. Those are like a part of our legacy and a part of our history, and potentially hardwired in at some point, or we would make the case, Jung would make the case that is how it is. And again, I do think it's interesting to default to like Franz de Waal's observations of chimps and bonobos, right, which are like nearest ancestors. And there's absolutely very crystallized hierarchies that just consistently come into play. There's these power dynamics, but they don't have titles, right? But there's like very consistent hierarchy. And so Robert Bly talks about this fantasy. He calls it the sibling society. His metaphor is that we've become enamored with this idea that the house doesn't need parents anymore, and we can all just be siblings. And it's this like adolescent fantasy of equality, effectively, but who that ends up hurting, his point at least, who that ends up hurting the most is the youngest children, who end up not having access to the parent figures, and that's who actually gets left behind by that ideology.
And there's something there as well about everybody has an idol of some form, and an idol is sits at the top of some sort of hierarchy, you could say, and we sort of pattern ourselves after it. And then in the book, pater, the root of pater is father, pater and pater, father. So we're all sort of, whether we like it or not, sort of moving towards something that sits above us. And if you're not, you're sort of probably static.
Super interesting. This reminds me of have you guys came across René Girard's work on mimetic theory, mimetic desire? This seems to be very linked in, especially with the scapegoat mechanism and all too.
Yeah, we recite him in the book a few times.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
So something that jumped out at me was one sentence from the book. I'm just going to read it out, and maybe Brant, if you want to expand on this. That which offends us reveals us.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that referencing how I stepped away from the first conference. That was like one of the big light bulb moments. Again, Dr. Brissett, Leslie's just genius, and he was doing that thing you were saying, where he was seeing what the taboo pieces were. He was just doing a fantastic job at like naming the stuff I did not want him to talk about. This work would be impotent if it didn't have the capacity to offend us. The emotional response of being offended is our cue that we're getting into the good shit, so to speak, right? We're getting like those unexplored pieces, the parts that we have deemed off limits. That, how dare you bring that up? How dare you talk about that? It touches on our insecurities, and those places where there is that anxiety and that insecurity. that's where the dynamics can really take hold and grab us for a ride. Like that is where those puppet strings attach, is how I would say it. And so, easier said than done, right? Like when we find ourselves as humans offended, the tendency is to dim our awareness, to project the bad onto that other person. We don't often want to, like, as a first response, go towards introspection and getting curious about that situation. But in this work, and probably in life in general, we should. It's really showing us something about ourselves if we're willing to pay attention. That's kind of my point there.
So if we notice something that really angers us, that should be a trigger for us to get curious. It might not be possible in the moment, but after the strong emotion has passed, like think about it later and then get curious about it and wonder what might be going on there.
Yeah, and Aodhán brings this into our book, talking about the role of the jester and the culture of comedians and the role that they're playing in our current culture. I think what you're talking about and what we're discussing here is maybe not explicitly named, but extremely prevalent in the culture of comedians right now. Like there's the roast culture. Tony Hinchcliffe, for example, made national headlines. It's a joke he told at like a Republican convention or something, but his show Kill Tony is about, like, it's all just like them roasting each other, and they intentionally step over the line and are offensive in many ways. And it's kind of like there's this little bit of there's this game. It's like, can I offend you? I haven't heard it like spoken to as directly, but if you're in that environment and you allow yourself to be offended, you lost. Like that is you've lost your cool or whatever. The most successful people in the comedian sphere right now are not those, like, there's remaining loose, remaining fluid with it, and not allowing yourself to be offended conveys like a higher level of development.
As we're talking here about, the jester archetype, or the joker archetype, if you had to sort of name a few, which archetypal energies do you think our culture and society is currently most deficient in, that it's maybe harming us? Does anything come to mind there when I ask that question?
For sure. Aodhán, do you have something on top of mind? I can
well, it's hard not to talk about this without sort of going into the culture wars. But then I guess the question is, well, the whole purpose of the work is to, like, sort of explore why these things are happening in society, rather than taking a side, even though, we're all biased to some degree. But the wise king is probably the one that's missing. The wise king. I don't know how to expand on that anymore, but yeah, the wise king, I think. Yeah.
Well, in the authors who I think do the best job of describing the wise king are Moore and Gillette in their King, Warrior, Magician, Lover book, which is phenomenal. But they talk about, like, the king archetype is supposed to be generative. There's supposed to be like a healing element there. Effectively, a king should unite the kingdom, right? And regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, I would say we lack that dividing energy at higher levels. Things feel divisive. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we lack that unifying energy, you mean, right? But that reminds me of De Waal again, because he found that the alpha of the pack is the one who reconciles division, not the one who controls by power or through tyranny.
Well, and you can often ascend to the throne by overthrow through violent means, but you don't hold on to power without that generative function. So that feels relevant. Another one that comes to mind for sure is we talk about the Gilgamesh myth with Enkidu, Babylonian myth, and I think that's an excellent parable. I won't tell the whole thing right now, but I think it's an excellent parable around integrating what folks might refer to as toxic masculinity with the wild man energy, and we kind of do a deep dive into that piece. But yeah, we see it's connected to what we just talked about, right? Like a disconnected and divisive version of masculine energy. And we're lacking in that kind of unifying kingly energy.
Sure. As I was preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about scapegoats, and I used to be part of a Gaelic football team where I'm from, and there was one guy, and he just was always a scapegoat from like day one. And I thought of him, and I thought that's just such a tragic position to be in, you know. So I was just wondering, is there anything that somebody that's in that situation or another unfavorable archetypal role? They're in a team, they're in a group, and they might not necessarily want to get out of it, and they're in that position. What can they do? Like, what are their options? You know, how do you get yourself out of that situation?
Yeah, I had a friend asked me that too, and like I exchanged some of our earlier manuscript talking about that. I'd say my take, and Aodhán, I'm curious to hear about yours, but I do believe that anxiety, like personal anxiety, and how that bubbles up, ends up being like Velcro for roles. Or as I was saying, it's like that's where the puppet string attaches. I think it's very difficult to get out of a role that you want to move away from if you're anxious, if you're attached to being perceived a certain way. The times where I've seen groups audition people, so to speak, for a scapegoat role and it not stick, it's usually there's no pushback. There's nothing for the group to really like have a fight with. I've gone through iterations where I've done that worse or better before, right? Like there are times where something happens in the group and it gets under your skin, but in those moments, we are like presenting a large Velcro surface for like roles to stick to us. So I think that's like the starting point. I'll say this too. This is not what I think you normally hear group dynamics professionals say about it, but I think we as humans understand that when a group is trying to slot us into, there's an art of laying low in a way. Like if the group is determined to have a scapegoat, they're going to find a scapegoat. And it's kind of a dark way to look at it because it's not really solving the group dynamics in that moment. But if you're not trying to find yourself in that role, checking your own anxiety and like just not like stepping into the spotlight and making your voice be prominent around like hot issues for a moment. You can give it a little space to cool off. I think that would be like on the down low personal advice I would give to folks who are finding themselves like being auditioned for a scapegoat.
Mm-hmm. I think there's an awareness as well. I think, you know, people probably find that I can think of a couple of people probably find themselves in these positions because they don't know. They're not aware of these. They're not aware of these sort of things that are happening to them. So from getting from 0 to 1 there, I think that requires probably getting burned a couple of times and then asking yourself, like getting reflective, like what the hell is going on here? Like, because, you know, and you might never get through to some people. Some people might just get back into that same spot over and over again, you know?
I think if you can answer the question to yourself too, if you can have grounded energy and ask yourself the question, you know, what am I getting from being in a scapegoat role? Like, what is it doing for me? Where's my enjoyment in that? Which is not the same as blaming the victim, but it is like a piece of introspection you can do, right? Like what I would say the mature way, the evolved way of looking at a group dynamic like that is to start to ask this question. It is not to project back onto the group. Well, they're bad. They're mean. They're scapegoating me. I've seen folks really entrench themselves in scapegoating roles by trying to lecture the group. You guys are scapegoating me. Like that does not go over well. You got to get introspective and like work on your own anxiety and then like work on just the acknowledgement of like, okay, if I'm in a role, there's a contract here that I've signed on some level that I'm getting some sort of benefit from this. I get to like act out this conflict that I'm transfixed by. There's some sort of deal. Like, what am I getting out of it?
Yeah. And I was just reminded of like a famous YouTuber, I won't mention the name of. He said like, you give advice of not dominating a group. So like if you're in a group situation and you're scapegoated, there's probably some sort of out of the anxiety, you're sort of always trying to interject or dominate a group, not out of like a badness, but out of an anxiety. But if you literally just chill out and let the group do its thing and just add to the group rather than sort of from a place of centeredness and groundedness rather than anxiety, I think that's probably good advice.
Those are wise words. And something that stuck out for me from the book was like, if you are in a new group where the hierarchy isn't explicit yet and these roles haven't been assigned yet, it's usually not a good idea to try and assume the first leadership role because often that first leader will be scapegoated, which is interesting. I wouldn't have been aware of that, but it was good to know, you know?
Yeah, totally. I would say I would stop short of saying that that's a universal rule in all groups. But I think the way I think about it is that in groups where there is not a specifically delineated hierarchy already in play, I think that a wise stance is to, you have is to basically hold off on trying to step center stage and try to lead. The group is navigating questions of identity and norms, and those things will shift rather quickly. If we look at like the group stages of forming, norming, storming, whatever, like there's forming, storming, norming, there's going to be a shift in what the group is after, so to speak, or what the group is hoping to achieve on a subconscious level. And those shifts require different shades of leadership. And so if you first of all, I would ask this of anyone I was coaching. If you find yourself wanting to be in the spotlight and stepping up and saying, all right, people, let's talk about X, Y, and Z before those beginning stages have been navigated. Like, what is that? What is it that is pulling you into that role? Why is there a valence there? Like, why do you have Velcro for that? Why do you feel the need? Which can be rich exploration. But yeah, and then moving towards understanding that you don't need to compulsively step into lead, because usually that's what it is. It's not usually in a group relations conference. There's no good excuse for feeling the need to do that immediately. You don't have some deliverable that you got to get done by the end of the day where you don't get paid. That's what's great about it, is it strips away all these like incentive type of stories that we can tell ourselves. Like, well, no, I had to do that because X, Y, and Z. It's like, no, you're here for 5 days or 2 weeks at Leicester. You don't have to do anything. Why did you feel the need to step into that role?
An example of this is from my first conference, the presidential one. I did a couple online during COVID before I did my first in-person one. And in the intergroup event, again, all of the different organizations that run group relations conferences might have little variations, but as soon as the intergroup event happened and we were sort of given the baton by the directors to go ahead and start to form groups, I literally just ran out of the room, darted immediately into one of the rooms that were allocated. Again, that was an anxiety ridden move, and a bunch of people followed me. And then that made me question like, oh my God, like, if you're not sure about, if you're not confident in your leadership and you're a lot of people follow you, how do you navigate that? And, it made me question a lot of things, actually.
Yeah, for sure. That's tricky. Have you got any, based on everything you've studied about group relations, have you got any advice for people that are about to start a family? Anything that might be applicable to doing? Anything that they should avoid doing? Like anything come to mind there?
It's a good one. One of my best friends just had his first kid, so and I just became an uncle this year, so lots of that going on. Um, I think this work serves to build awareness, to build self reflective capacity, and those are are good things as a parent, right? So I would, I'm a big fan of applied therapeutic and psychological principles, like informing relationships. Like if you do it well, not that example I was talking about of the second year grad student at a Thanksgiving table, but the ability to get curious about dynamics and to take that step rather than just acting out our anxiety immediately is probably helps us not screw up our kids as much, I would think.
What comes to mind is like containment. So rather than working out of a place again of sort of anxiety or sort of I don't know, unconscious coercion in your relationships with your partner, if you can kind of step out of a place of you can more own your own emotions by becoming more aware of how you act and react in groups.
Yeah. And going back to referencing Robert Bly and the idea of like the sibling society, it's okay to be a parent. It's okay to, you need to be okay holding some authority as a parent. There's this acronym used in group relations work, BART, boundaries, authority, role, task. And I'd say a large amount of my generation and the generation younger has taken up this fantasy around almost like abdicating authority as a parent. And that's not good. That's like going to be just confusing. Like that's not to Aodhán's point, we're abandoning, we're failing in our containment function if we're taking that stance.
Yeah, and again, it's like what there's going to be people that can speak to this way more because I'm not yet a father, but yeah, what can you idolize then? If you're sort of left to figure things out on your own, if everything you do is okay, if there's no boundaries, there's no authority, if there's no direction, you're sort of leaving kids to figure things out on their own, and that's disastrous.
For sure. Right. This has been really interesting, guys. For anybody that wants to dive deeper into this after this conversation, I would definitely recommend your book. It's Gods, Heroes, and Groups. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah. It's available on the Karnak website primarily.
Karnak Books.
Brilliant. And any other resources you'd recommend that might be worth checking out too for people that want to dive deeper?
Do a group relations conference for sure. We can try and link some, Niall, for the listeners. What would you recommend, Brant?
Yeah, there are some solid resources that dive in and take a more or less academic approach to looking at group dynamics work, and I find those fairly interesting for somebody that is just getting into it. Reading Wilfred Bion's experiences in groups might be a tough chew. But that Franz de Waal's book, Our Inner Ape, I think is a very interesting one. And something that's cool about looking at chimps and bonobos is that we don't get stuck in identifying with them. We can look frankly and honestly at the things happening in the groups and the power dynamics without it allows us to bypass some filter that we have when we're looking at human groups. It's so messy often. That book, I think, is very accessible, and it also, a lot of it really does apply. So as like a starting point for reading something that you can go read that one at the beach and not just feel like you're doing a bunch of heavy lifting studying. It's enjoyable, and it can start to kind of get you curious about some of that stuff. So Our Inner Ape would be my first introduction.
Fantastic. And where can people find you both online?
Yeah, the Karnak Books is our publisher. I believe we have a Kindle version on Amazon, but
sorry, I know your answer. I meant, where can they find you personally online? If you like, do you have a website or a Twitter handle or?
Yeah.
Aodhán?
You can find me on Twitter at Aodhán P. Moran, and you can put that in the description. It's difficult to spell. And then Brant is the group lens, right?
Yeah, at the group lens, I'm not especially active. I mostly log on to see what Aodhán is posting and retweet that to my tiny amount of followers. But Aodhán's pretty active and he posts like very thoughtful content. He's a good follow.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks a million, guys. This has been really interesting. I've enjoyed every minute of this, and I want to wish you the best going forward.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.